Okay, everybody, so today's video, outside video, wandering down my street. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some World War I stuff with regard to women. You know, when we see war stuff, we usually see men and soldiers and, you know, maybe airplanes and pilots and stuff like that. Well, there were women's involvement in war has always been there. It's just been different. You know, in modern days now, you're starting to see more women in combat around the world in various armies, including the Canadian ones. So what I want to talk to you about from World War I perspective, though, is women's role in World War I. It was a varied, you know, there really were no women in combat in World War I, but they were involved a lot. There was a lot of nurses, ambulance drivers on the actual war front, but women did a big part of their work back on the home front. So a lot of the men were away at war. So the women had to do a lot of the work back home with regard to the way they worked in factories, especially in military factories, making bombs, making guns, making clothing, making, you know, all those different things. So women's role was a vital part of the war thing, but it wasn't a sort of, I hesitate to say the word glamorous, but it wasn't sort of the sort of soldier part of war. It's all the hidden stuff, you know, that we almost never see. Wars don't happen without all the other things behind it, without the cooks, without the bootmakers, without all those different things. So that was one of the major parts of women's roles in World War I. And so it's quite interesting to see from that is that, I mean, there are some perspectives of World War I and how that the rights of women actually began there, because women for the first time were sort of working out of the house, away from the home a good amount of the time, because they had to go work in these factories. Well, all of a sudden they were getting like these jobs, and they started to like the jobs, and even though they weren't getting paid as much as the men, they were starting to get used to the idea of they didn't have to rely on the men for the money, you know. So these temporary workers, you know, begins a lot of the ideas about women and their sort of ideas for freedom. Just walking through the forest here now, you can kind of see nice little area. So that's the first part. You know, one of the major parts about when you're thinking about World War I and women is that a lot of the women's rights issues kind of begin there, as because then the necessity of having women in the workforce occurs really for the first time. I mean, women were traditionally, you know, back at home, teachers or nurses or those kind of things, but they didn't work in factories, etc. So women all of a sudden get an opportunity to do this, and they excelled, and they ended up liking it, and they didn't want to go back. So when the men came back from war, they sort of expected women to just go back to the old ways of house and stuff, but a lot of women didn't want that. You know, they wanted to be free. They have a level of freedom that men had. So that's another part of it. Sort of it's this idea that the war and the wartime was actually a really liberating experience for a lot of the women. It gave them the opportunities that they had never really had before. All right, so that's kind of what I want you to look at with regard to women. You know, we often sort of either dismiss or disregard the role of women, and ultimately the role that World War I played on the rights of women. So we're going to be spending some time throughout the course talking about the evolution of women's rights and the evolution of women's roles within a society. All right, thanks. We'll talk to you soon.